The drill bit emerged from the darkness, like a messenger from another world, ascending through 2,300 feet of crushing stone, through layers of copper and gold that had been mined for more than a century. When the operators pulled it into the harsh August sun of the Atacama Desert, they found something that made their hands tremble. A crumpled piece of paper wrapped around the metal shaft, secured with tape that had somehow survived the violent journey through rock. The message was written in bold red letters, each word a defiant shout against the mountain's silence. 17 days had passed since the earth swallowed 33 men whole, and no one knew if they had drawn even a single breath beyond that first terrible moment. The note read, "Simply estamos bien en el refugio, lost 33. We are well in the shelter," the 33 dot above ground. The families who had refused to leave erupted in tears and shouts that echoed across the barren hills. Camp Esperanza Camp Hope had grown from sleeping bags in car trunks to a settlement of tents and makeshift shrines, a testament to love that would not surrender to stone. These wives and mothers and children had prayed through cold desert nights when officials spoke in careful tones about the impossibility of survival. When engineers admitted that the mountain might never release its grip, now they held each other and wept, because somewhere in that impossible darkness, hearts were still beating. The drill operators stood silent, understanding they had just witnessed something that transcended their machinery and expertise. Below, in a space no larger than a studio apartment, 33 men heard the clanging of the drill bit departing and knew their message had reached the world above. Jose Henriquez had been a miner for 33 years, the same number as the men now trapped beside him. He was 54 years old, his hands scarred from decades of working in the deep places where light never reached, where the weight of the earth pressed down with a force that could crush steel. He was also a Pentecostal preacher, a man who had carried his faith into the darkness every working day of his adult life, who had seen God's hand in narrow escapes and impossible survivals. His grandfather had been a minister, and Jose had watched as a boy how the old man could bring peace to troubled souls with nothing but words and prayer and an unshakable conviction that they were never alone. Now, in the aftermath of the cave-in that had sealed them all inside the mountain, Jose found himself being called upon to become what his grandfather had been, a shepherd in the valley of the shadow. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The collapse had come at 2 p.m. on August 5, 2010. At the San Jose copper-gold mine, 45 kilometers north of Copiapó. The mine had been opened in 1889, its tunnels spiraling down into the Atacama Desert like the coils of some ancient serpent, descending through geological time into seams of precious metal that had formed before human feet ever walked the earth. It was not a safe place. 8 people had died in accidents there over the previous dozen years, and the owners had been fined repeatedly for violations that everyone knew about but no one had the power to change. The miners had noticed a crack in the ramp that morning, the central road that connected all the tunnels and provided the only way to the surface. Some had mentioned it to their supervisors, speaking in the careful tones men use when they need their paycheck more than they need to be right. But the mountain had been rumbling for years, and the work continued because it always had, because there were families to feed and bills to pay, and because sometimes men convince themselves that disaster only comes for other people. When the rock fell, it fell all at once, single piece, standing 550 feet tall, weighing 770,000 tons, dropping into the ramp like a stopper into a bottle. The sound was beyond sound, a physical force that threw men to the ground and filled the air with dust so thick that they were blind for 6 hours, breathing through their shirts, calling out names in the darkness to know who had survived. 34 men had been in the mine when it happened. One, a truck driver near the entrance, managed to escape before the last way out disappeared. The remaining 33 retreated deeper into the mountain, away from the thundering collapse, searching for the emergency refuge that mining regulations required. They found it, but when they opened the door, they discovered that the emergency rations meant to last 2 weeks for 25 Men would have to sustain 33 for however long it took the world above to remember them. There was no radio that worked, no medical kit, no ladders in the escape chimneys that should have offered another way to the surface. The darkness was absolute. When they turned off their helmet lamps to conserve batteries, a darkness that pressed against their eyes like a physical thing. The heat was oppressive 95 degrees Fahrenheit with humidity that bred fungal infections on skin that never dried. But they rationed the emergency food with a discipline that bordered on the sacred, each man receiving a single tablespoon of canned tuna every other day, a morsel so small it barely registered on the tongue. They found water in radiators and a spring that trickled from the rock. And they created a routine, because routine was what separated men from animals, because without it, they would descend into violence and despair. Mario Sepulveda, energetic and fierce, emerged as a practical leader, organizing shifts and managing conflicts with the intensity that had earned him the nickname, Perry Little Dog, for his loyalty and his bite. But when the practical work was done, when the rocks had been cleared and the modest tasks completed, the men looked to José Henriquez for something that food and water could not provide. They all knew José was a Christian. He had never hidden it, never pushed it on anyone, but neither had he pretended to be something he wasn't. On the second day in the refuge, when the reality of their situation had fully settled over them like a second collapse, the men asked him to lead them in prayer. José told them simply, "As God's children, we pray to the living God. So, if you want to pray to that God, I will, but if you want to do something else, then look for somebody else." The response was immediate and unanimous. "We want to pray the way you know how to pray." So José began what would become the rhythm of their days, the heartbeat that would keep them sane and together. They held prayer services twice each day, at noon and at 6 in the evening, gathering in a circle in the dim light of their carefully rationed lamps. At first, it was just José's voice in the darkness, speaking words that had sustained people in caves and prisons and deserts for thousands of years. But as the days became a week, and then 2 weeks, something began to change. Men who had never prayed began to speak aloud, their voices awkward at first, then growing stronger as they opened their hearts in ways they never had above ground. They formed a prayer chain, holding hands in a circle, and José would preach after they had all spoken, sharing the gospel with the same plain honesty he brought to everything. He gave them prayer tasks to complete during the hours between services, small disciplines to keep their minds focused on hope rather than the suffocating weight of stone above their heads. They sang hymns that echoed through the tunnels, and some of the men wept because they had never felt close to anything holy before. But here, in the deepest darkness they had ever known, they encountered light. The miners didn't know it then, but above them, the Chilean government was preparing to announce their deaths. On day 10, a senior official approached Reverend Alf Cooper, chaplain to President Sebastián Pinera, with tears in her eyes, telling him the miners must have run out of food 3 days ago, that there seemed to be no hope. The drill teams had tried 7 times to reach the area where the men might be, and 7 times the probe had missed its target, emerging empty from the mountain. Engineers spoke carefully about the geometry of stone, about the impossibility of hitting such a small target through so much rock, about the sad mathematics that made rescue seem like a dream. But the families at Camp Esperanza refused to believe in death, refused to pack up their tents and go home to grieve. They had erected 33 flags, 32 Chilean and 1 Bolivian for Carlos Mamanian, the hill overlooking the mine, and they kept vigil through nights so cold that candles were the only warmth. Below, in their refuge, the 33 men marked time in shifts of work and prayer, clearing rubble and reinforcing walls, playing dominoes made from scraps and checkers fashioned from whatever they could find. José continued his twice-daily services with a steadiness that became their anchor. And slowly, remarkably, 22 of the men who had never called themselves Christians began to believe. Not because José preached at them, he was never that kind of evangelist, but because faith was no longer an abstraction, no longer something to be discussed in comfortable pews above ground. Here, faith was oxygen. It was the thing that kept panic from exploding into violence, kept despair from curdling into madness. They felt something present with them in that refuge, something that Jose called their 34th companion, and even the skeptics could not deny that something beyond their own strength was holding them together. The 17th day dawned with the sound of drilling, fainter than before but unmistakable, growing louder hour by hour. The men listened with a concentration that bordered on prayer, tracking the drill's progress through stone by sound alone, holding their breath as it came closer. They had heard this before 6 times, 7, always ending in silence as the drill passed them by, missing their location by meters that might as well have been miles. Jose gathered them for prayer as the sound grew deafening, and they asked God for what seemed impossible, that somehow, through all that rock, through the labyrinth of tunnels and chambers, the drill would find them. The engineers above had calculated the coordinates as precisely as their instruments allowed. But stone is not precise, and mountains shift in ways that no equation can predict. When the drill broke through into their refuge, the sound was so loud they couldn't hear themselves shout, and then suddenly it stopped, and there was only the echo and the smell of hot metal. Mario Gomez, 63 years old and one of the oldest miners, was closest to the drill. He grabbed the bit with hands that shook, wrapping it with the note they had prepared, securing it with tape, and tapping the metal to signal those above to pull it up. Then they waited in a silence that felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, knowing that if this drill, too, came back empty, hope would die. But when it returned, when the operators sent it back down, loaded with water and glucose, solution and medicine, the 33 men understood they had been found. The note they sent up had been simple and factual. All 33 alive, all in the shelter. But what they felt in that moment was beyond words. It was the weight of the mountains suddenly shared, no longer pressing down on them alone. Jose led them in a prayer of thanksgiving that became a shout of joy, and men who hadn't cried in decades wept without shame. Above ground, the celebration was equally explosive. The families at Camp Esperanza heard the news, and their prayers became shouts. Their candles now lit in thanksgiving rather than vigil. The world's media, which had begun to drift away as hope faded, suddenly descended in force. Reporters from 180 countries, more than 1,500 journalists, transforming the desert camp into a global stage. The Chilean government, which had been preparing to announce a tragedy, instead found itself coordinating what would become one of the most complex rescue operations in history, involving 3 separate drilling rigs, NASA advisors, and experts from a dozen nations. Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, all drilling simultaneously, racing to create a tunnel wide enough to bring a man through. The miners below organized themselves into 3 shifts, working 8-hour rotations to clear the debris from the drilling and shore up the walls. But their real work was waning and believing. Through the narrow borehole just 6 inches, across supplies now descended every hour in containers called palomas, doves, food and water, medicine for the fungal infections and respiratory problems, but also Bibles, and at Jose's request, an MP3 player loaded with the New Testament in Spanish and an audio version of the Jesus film. The miners continued their prayer services at noon and 6. But now they had scripture to guide them. And the word of God moved through that refuge like water through parched ground. Men who had mocked religion their entire lives began to ask Jose questions in the hours between services. And he would open the small Bible sent down with a magnifying glass, because it had to be small enough to fit through the tube, and show them what he meant. Some of the conversions were dramatic. Men falling to their knees in the muddy floor and surrendering their lives with the totality that only the prospect of death can. Inspired the world above watched on television, as the drilling continued day and night, the sound of it becoming the soundtrack of a nation holding its breath. Chilean President Sebastián Pinera visited Camp Esperanza repeatedly, and international leaders called to offer support. Presidents and prime ministers, speaking words of solidarity across the distance that separated their comfortable offices from the men in the mountain. But down below, time moved differently. The miners measured progress not in feet drilled, but in the quality of their endurance, in their ability to remain human under conditions that would break most men. They made videos to send up through the narrow shaft, trying to reassure families and the watching world that they were doing well. And Mario Sepulveda hosted these videos with manic energy that earned him the nickname Super Mario from the media. But at noon and 6 o'clock, they gathered for prayer, and that was when they spoke the truth of their fear and faith. On September 19th, 45 days after the collapse, the Plan B drill began its final approach. The miners could hear it through the rock, a sound that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats. But this time it was aimed directly at an accessible chamber rather than the refuge where they'd spent the first 17 days. The engineers had learned from their near misses, had refined their calculations and adjusted for the mountain's deceptions. But even with all their expertise, even with the best technology three nations could provide, there was still the element of chance, the wild card of geology that no human skill could fully predict. As the drill approached its target depth, it struck a rogue rock formation with enough force to deflect its course. The engineers above didn't know if this deflection was catastrophic or providential. Didn't know if they had just added weeks to the timeline or seconds. Then the drill broke through, and the shout that rose from below could be heard even on the surface. Jose Henriquez would later tell anyone who would listen that even the unbelieving scientists had called it a miracle that the drill hit that rock and deflected at exactly the angle needed to intersect with the chamber where 33 men were waiting. He never called it luck or chance or good fortune. He called it by its proper name, the hand of God. The miners attached another note to this drill bit, and Jose added his own message to his wife Blanca, words of love that had waited 69 days to travel through stone. The world above learned that the 33 were not just alive, but spiritually transformed. That a refuge had become a sanctuary. That the darkness had produced light. The final drilling for Plan B, the winning plan, was completed on October 9th, nearly 2 months ahead of the original estimate, and the rescue capsule named Phoenix was prepared to descend. On the night of October 12, at 10:54 p.m., the Phoenix capsule was lowered into the shaft that three nations had drilled through. 2,300 feet of hostile stone. It took 15 minutes for it to descend, and for those 15 minutes, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. 5.3 million people watched on live video streams, a global audience larger than most sporting events, because this was not entertainment, it was hope made visible. It was the triumph of human persistence and divine grace over the indifference of geology. Florencio Avalos, 31 years old, was the first to enter the capsule below. The first to make that vertical journey through darkness, toward the stars. When he emerged 12 minutes later into the cold desert night, into the blinding lights of cameras and the roar of celebration, he stumbled and was caught by President Piñera himself. And the sound that rose from Camp Esperanza was the sound of a nation exhaling. One by one through that night and into the morning of October 13th, the miners returned to the surface. Some emerged laughing, others weeping, some falling to their knees the moment they touched the ground. Esteban Rojas knelt with his hands together in prayer, then raised his arms to the sky in adoration. Carlos Mamani, the Bolivian who had moved to Chile a decade before, also knelt and gave thanks. Omar Regadas emerged holding a Bible and wearing a helmet with Dios vive, God lives written across it in bold letters. Each man carried pieces of the collapsed rock in his pockets, souvenirs of the mountain that had tried to consume them, proof that they had been to the underworld and returned. The families who had waited at Camp Esperanza for 69 days finally held their husbands and sons and brothers, and some of the reunions were so private and sacred that even the cameras turned away. Jose Henriquez was the 24th man to emerge, stepping out of the Phoenix capsule in the afternoon of October 13th after 70 days underground. He had insisted on being among the last, believing that a shepherd should not leave until all the sheep were safe. When he finally reached the surface, Blanca was waiting, and they held each other while the world watched and understood. They were witnessing something that transcended politics and geology, something that spoke to the deepest human need, to be found when lost, to be remembered when forgotten, to discover that love is stronger than stone. Jose's first public words were not about the horror of entrapment or the miracle of survival, they were about prayer. He told reporters that prayer had been their oxygen, that while they could pray, there had always been hope. He spoke about the 34th companion who had been with them in the darkness. The reunion of the 33 with their families was broadcast across the world, and for a brief moment, the usual divisions of human society seemed less important than the simple fact that these men had survived. But what the cameras could not fully capture was the spiritual transformation that had occurred beneath the mountain. 22 men had become Christians during their entrapment, had knelt in muddy stone, and surrendered their lives to something larger than themselves. They had experienced what most people only read about: a trial that stripped away every pretense and every escape, that forced them to confront what they truly believed about life and death and meaning. The prayer circles led by Jose Henriquez had not been a performance or a ritual to pass time. They had been a lifeline, a discipline that kept 33 individuals from fracturing into chaos. That transformed a group of strangers into a brotherhood in the months and years that followed. The 33 would find that coming back to the surface was not the end of their journey, but the beginning of a new one. Some would struggle with post-traumatic stress, with nightmares that returned them to the darkness, with the impossible weight of being symbols rather than men. Some would find fame uncomfortable, others would chase it. The bonds formed in the mountain would strain under the pressures of ordinary life, and not all the friendships would survive the transition from stone to sunlight. But when they came together, when the 33 gathered for anniversaries or interviews, or simply because they needed to be near, the only other people who truly understood what they had endured the love was evident. They had seen each other at their worst and at their best, had shared fear and faith in equal measure, had learned that survival is not just a physical act but a spiritual discipline. Jose Henriquez became a witness to what had happened in the mine, traveling to churches and universities, speaking to congregations and presidents, carrying the message that prayer is more than wishful thinking, is the breath of faith, the oxygen of the soul. He spoke at the White House for the presidential prayer breakfast, stood in Durham Cathedral, and told his story to students who had never been deeper underground than a basement. He wrote a book called Miracle in the Mine, not to claim credit for himself, but to testify to what he had witnessed. That faith can sustain life where logic says life should fail. That hope is not defeated by stone, that grace descends through narrow shafts to reach men in darkness. He remained humble about his role, always redirecting praise away from himself and toward the God he believed had been their 34th companion, always insisting that he had simply done what his grandfather taught him, to pray without ceasing. The story of the 33 resonated across cultures and beliefs, because it touched something universal. The image of men trapped in darkness, rationing hope along with food, organizing their days around prayer rather than despair. This was a metaphor every human could understand. The mountain that tried to swallow them whole became a symbol of all the obstacles that threatened to crush human dignity, and their emergence into light became a promise that rescue is possible. That waiting is not the same as abandoning hope, that sometimes the way out requires going deeper in. The families at Camp Esperanza, who refused to leave even when officials spoke of impossibility, became heroes in their own right. Proof that love can outlast stone, that vigil has power, that there are some separations that faith simply will not accept. The technical aspects of the Rescue the 3 drilling plans, the international cooperation, the Phoenix capsule designed to hold a man in a space no wider than a coffin for a 15-minute journey through crushing rock. These were marvels of engineering and human ingenuity. But the miners themselves insisted that the real miracle was not the drilling, but the deflection. Not the capsule, but the community. They pointed to the moment when the drill struck that rogue rock formation and bounced at exactly the angle needed to find them, when geometry and chance conspired in a way that the engineers themselves could not explain without using words like providence and miraculous. They spoke about the rations that should have run out, but somehow sustained them through 17 days of uncertainty, about the unity that should have collapsed into violence, but instead deepened into brotherhood. What happened in the San Jose mine in Lautenlin Isha changed Chile's understanding of itself, shifting the national identity from the shadows of dictatorship to a moment of collective hope and triumph. But more than that, it changed the men who had been buried. Some of them would say that they went into the mountain as miners, men defined by their labor and their paychecks, but came out as witnesses, carrying a message about the power of faith and community that no amount of copper or gold could purchase. They had touched death close enough to feel its breath, had sat in darkness deep enough to make men mad, had been forgotten by the mine owners and remembered by God. The transformation was visible in their eyes, in the way they spoke about prayer and persistence, in their insistence that survival had required more than food and water, had required belief. The story lives on in books and films, in the testimonies Jose continues to give in churches around the world, in the way parents tell their children about the 33 men who prayed their way out of the mountain. It lives on at Camp Esperanza, which has been preserved as a memorial, and in the Museum of Mining in Copiapó, where the Phoenix capsule sits as a reminder of what humans can accomplish when they refuse to accept defeat. But most of all, it lives on in the hearts of the 33 themselves, who carry the memory of those 69 days like a scar that has become sacred, a wound that has transformed into wisdom. They know what most people only theorize, that faith is not believing without evidence. It is continuing to hope when all evidence suggests hope is foolish. It is kneeling in muddy stone and praying to a God you cannot see, because the alternative is to surrender to darkness. This account of prayer, perseverance, and providence beneath the Chilean desert is based on verified repio from multiple international sources, documenting the Aling Copiapó mining accident and its aftermath. The story of Jose Henriquez and the 33 miners has been chronicled by BBC News, The Guardian, CNN, NBC News, and other major outlets that covered the rescue operation as it unfolded. Henriquez's own testimony appears in his book, Miracle in the Mine, 1. Man's Story of Strength and Survival in the Chilean Mines, published by Zon, and in interviews he has given at Dallas Baptist University, Durham Cathedral, and churches worldwide. The details of the twice-daily prayer services, the drill deflection that engineers called miraculous, and the spiritual transformation of 22 miners are drawn from first-hand accounts given by Henriquez and corroborated by journalists and rescue personnel present at the scene. This is a true story of how faith became oxygen in a place where breath itself seemed impossible, how 33 men became a brotherhood through prayer, and how a refuge carved from stone became a sanctuary where hope refused to die.